Okay, so we're just going to dive right in. So what are emotions? What is an emotion? Emotion is a complex state of being that consists of three different things, usually, is what we say. So it's a physiological component, a behavioral component, and a cognitive component. So that physiological component, it involves our body. So the physical arousal of our body. So like, for example, when you watch a scary movie, the physiological response to fear is going to be sweating, increased heart rate, really anything, your body's response to that epinephrine that pops up with that fight or flight response. All of those changes are going to constitute that physiological component of emotion. We have a behavioral component as well. So that's a behavioral or physical response to the stimulus causing the emotion. So in the same example, you may scream or look away very quickly during a scary scene. So the behavioral aspect of emotion is basically how we're reacting to the stimulus. So just like the example said, the behavior would be that sort of scream or that look away from an aversive stimulus. In this case, it would be if you're watching a scary movie. And then we have three, cognitive. So the interpretation of the situation. You may quickly experience fear during a jump scare in the movie, but quickly realize the monster has a laughable costume on, for example. So cognition does go into emotion. We sometimes have these sort of primary, these really knee-jerk reaction, knee-jerk emotions to a situation, but after cognitive appraisal and we realize what the situation is really about, our emotional state may change. For example, that last example that we just said about a monster popping out, the idea of a jump scare is pretty scary, and in practice it is scary, but as soon as we realize as soon as that moment passes, the jump scare isn't really there anymore. We realize what is popping out at us. We quickly come back to the realization that we're watching a movie. In the aftermath, that quick fear emotion is going to just fade away. And we may laugh a little bit. We may feel a little bit foolish that we were so scared by it. So there's definitely a cognitive component that's involved in emotional processing as well. So universal and adaptive emotions. So according to Charles Darwin, emotions had a biological basis that should transcend cultural differences. So obviously Darwin, you know him from natural selection. When we study evolution, we talk about Charles Darwin. So he was a proponent for this idea that that our facial expressions had this sort of universal norm, that there were certain facial expressions that had a biological basis that across all cultures everybody would be able to recognize. And it's still to this day, it seems that is true. So we recognize 6 universal emotions currently: happiness, sadness, surprise, fear, disgust, and anger. So if you look to the right, you can see this diagram right over here that shows all 6 of these. And you can show this to a person in Florida. You can show this to a person in northern China, and they should both, in theory, be able to decipher what each of these faces means. That's why we call them universal. So these emotions are all recognized and used across cultures, but keep in mind, expression of these emotions may vary. So every one of these cultures across the world should be able to recognize it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all going to use all of these emotions equally. So there are some cultures that might frown on expressing fear. So, in those cultures, you're going to see a lot less, emotional expression that would invoke the emotion of fear. So emotional arousal we have is also related to performance. So the Yerkes-Dodson law shows that the performance increases as emotional arousal does, according to an inverted U curve. So with an optimal performance occurring at moderate arousal, I actually have, I think I have a diagram of the Yerkes-Dodson law. We're going to come back to that a little bit when we talk about stress as well. But the inverted U curve is just an upside down U. And basically just what that means, it's sort of like, what it means is that at moderate stimulation, at that moderate emotional arousal, that is where optimal performance occurs. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in a little bit again, because that also relates to stress and stressors that we'll talk about. So just keep in mind that moderate, according to the Yerkes-Dodson law, sort of that moderate activation, moderate emotional arousal, moderate stress arousal usually leads to the optimal performance. We don't want to get on either side of the curve too far. And then we have emotions also provide a means of nonverbal communication and empathy. So we communicate through emotions, and we also experience empathy through emotions. So we can feel other people's emotions with them, and that's one of the things that makes us uniquely human. And that is again one of the adaptive components of emotion. It provides this sense of social cohesion, this advanced sense of communication, and it really allows us to form, a cohesive social unit, be that a family or a society or whatever level you want to analyze.